The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reproaction's July Act and Learn webinar on algorithmic surveillance and abortion access. If you're new to our webinars, we meet monthly to break down topics related to abortion rights and reproductive justice. So let's dig in. So who we are. My name is Shireen Shakori. I'm Executive Vice President and Chief of Staff here at Reproaction. I live in Washington, D.C., and I use she and her pronouns. And I will pass it to my co-host to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a fellow here at Reproaction, so here for the summer, and I'm also located in Washington, D.C. Very excited to be here.
Oops. We are so lucky to have Stephanie, I'm just going to add, with us through the Summer Collective Rising program through Collective Power for Reproductive Justice. If you haven't heard of it and you're a student or have a student in your life, please check them out. They're really awesome. I can't speak highly enough about the movement service that Collective Power provides. But on to our topic. So a brief overview of our agenda. We have an intro to Reproaction that I will be covering in just a minute. Then Stephanie is going to break down the basics of algorithmic surveillance. We'll get to speak to our experts about how this topic intersects with abortion access, and we'll wrap up with some quick plugs and then a Q&A with you, our audience. So if you have a question along the way, just type it into the question box or the chat and we will try to get to everyone. So like I said, who we are. Reproaction leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We bring a left flank analysis to that mission and a willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they are traditionally deemed allies or the opposition. And through all that, we have a commitment to nonviolent direct action. So now with that, I will kick it over to Stephanie to discuss more about our topic.
All right, thank you, Shireen, and thank you everyone for being here today. So before we turn it over to our amazing panelists that we have here, we're just going to give kind of a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. So to kind of start us off here, talking about what is algorithmic surveillance, what exactly does that mean, which is what we're really going to be covering today. So at large, algorithmic surveillance can take form a lot of different ways. Generally, it's any kind of software program like a virtual network or a platform that uses algorithms to monitor digital behavior. So this can mean a lot of different things for internet users. Generally, algorithmic surveillance can really threaten digital privacy by using invasive monitoring tools to track digital trends or personal information online. And again, this can take form through a lot of different ways. Generally, it's taken form through predictive analytics or recommendation systems that you see online that use your personal information to tailor your digital content. If you go to the next slide, Shireen. So exactly what does this mean for abortion access? So we're going to be kind of talking about that intersection today. So more generally, algorithmic surveillance kind of has a really large intersection with the abortion access movement by threatening users' digital privacy online. So things like predictive software, like those recommendation systems that I was mentioning, can track and monitor pregnant people's digital behavior online. And that information can later be employed by law enforcement, anti-abortion groups to target abortion seekers. Another way that we see this, this intersection is when folks have targeted ads from these predictive analytics, which then a pregnant person's family member or a partner can see those to determine that they are pregnant. And the pregnant person may not want those people to know that they're pregnant and or getting an abortion. So generally, these algorithms can disseminate users' information online, again, by tracking or selling their behavior, their information. And this can particularly happen when folks are self-managing their abortions, traveling outside of their states to get an abortion, or helping someone else seek an abortion and sharing this information online. If you go to the next slide, Shireen, thank you. So there's a lot of ways that folks can prevent from this kind of surveillance that we're seeing, and some of our panelists will kind of go more into depth about some of these strategies. But there are a lot of ways that folks can protect their digital privacy online. One of the major ways is using secure browsers and virtual private networks, which are also called VPNs. Which can really help protect your data and prevent it from being collected and monitored by algorithmic software. Another big way is using encrypted chat messaging systems, like outside of your kind of typical Apple messaging app, to discuss anything related to pregnancy-related information. An example of this is the Signal app, which is a secure messaging system. And again, using this kind of app to talk to someone else about your own pregnancy-related information or someone else's. And then the last way to really keep your information secure when it comes to abortion or pregnancy-related information is using trusted and secure tracking apps. A lot of ways that we see algorithmic surveillance take place is on things like period tracking apps. So using really secure apps to track pregnancy-related information. An example is the Yuki app. To prevent any of your pregnancy-related information from being stored and or sold to anti-abortion interests. All right, so that's kind of a little bit of an overview. If you want to go to the next slide, Shireen, I will pass it over to Shireen. Hopefully we have Daly in here. If we don't, then we can kind of switch things around a little bit, but I will pass it off to her to get started with our panelists.
Yes, some behind the scenes, there's always some kind of tech issue, but we do have all of our panelists accounted for. Sometimes the machines don't want to work. Maybe that's prescient, who knows? But thank you so much for introing the topic, Stephanie. I'm sure a lot of us have heard or even said, oh, it's so weird, the algorithm sent me XYZ, related to potential purchases or interests. It can be funny sometimes what these systems guess or intuit or judge based about our identities or user history. But when pregnancy information and abortion access comes into play, especially with the possibility of criminal implications that can come from it, it gets scarier. And so for that reason, I'm so glad we have experts like Daly to break it down with. Daly Barnett is a staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She works to reformat the antisocial aspects of information security for more social justice, pro-social causes. Before and especially after jobs, her work is focused on providing digital security advice and training to the abortion access movement and other intersecting movements for bodily autonomy. She's a hacker, educator, and writer. Thank you so much for joining us. And let me make sure, yes, we should have you on. Is that correct?
I'm here, yeah, if you can hear me okay.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. So I'll open up with the first question. Why are online software services allowed to take advantage of pregnancy-related information as compared to other medical-related information?
Well, I think that's basically because we lack comprehensive federal data privacy legislation. The data broker industry, which you sort of outlined in the ways that were delivered these like creepy, invasive, all-knowing advertisements. It's just one example of an unregulated mess of privacy violations that hurts everyone, but especially those now that are on shaky grounds because of these government decisions to criminalize healthcare.
Yeah, I think particularly with technology, we see policy and even concepts of what policy could be being so far behind how quickly the technology can move. So I'll move to another question. What are the major ways we've seen algorithmic surveillance impacting abortion access post-jobs?
Sure. Well, it depends on who you're asking. I tend to think of the varying threat models in the abortion access space falling into three different buckets. Although certainly these are not exhaustive, it's just a helpful way for me to categorize them. First, I think of the people that are just, seeking reproductive health care and their friends and family and others in their community who are helping them. Civilians, individuals, patients, just every type of person who is navigating the disappearing and criminalized healthcare while also living a life online and offline. So this person can be subject to the passive surveillance of social media, as you described. One example that comes to mind is Jessica Burgess, who helped her daughter navigate getting an abortion and was sentenced to 2 years in prison because of it. And the key evidence in that case was Facebook Messenger logs. But there's also the passive surveillance of street-level location technologies like cell towers and automatic license plate readers. There's the aforementioned unregulated data broker industry that gobbles up every bit of information available online. And then through advertisements and behavioral tracking mechanisms, it feeds into the system that procures information for whoever wants to buy it. Advertising agencies, law enforcement agencies, anti-choice freaks, etc. So that's just one bucket, right? Then there's the healthcare workers. They can still be subject to all of the types of surveillance I, described above, but as well as technologies that they're using in their workplace. So I'm thinking of electronic health records and health information exchanges and the like. Sometimes the extension of HIPAA, the privacy regulation framework for medical privacy, through these business associate agreements that they extend onto third-party applications in the healthcare industry, sometimes they don't go far enough, and these applications that are positioned between patient and provider communications have much more access and freedom to the data that is being produced by those communications. And then, of course, there's public records that can be weaponized against healthcare workers. I think of things like medical licenses and business registrations and the like. And then lastly, the third bucket that I think of that you might ask or be aware of are just activists and community organizers, people who are managing networks of information and managing networks of people, running abortion funds and organizing vast campaigns to destigmatize and advocate for the right to abortion. They're going to be a lot more likely to they're more likely to be subject to law enforcement surveillance, more pointed systems of surveillance, forensic technologies, surveillance of the mail system, so mail screens and mail covers, the geofencing surveillance of the protests they're organizing, and so on. And, of course, people can occupy one or more of these buckets. Those are just some ways that I tend to categorize them.
Sorry, the system was not letting me unmute myself for a second. Two things I really appreciated you talking about. One was HIPAA. We see a lot of questions and concerns around privacy of medical information when people interact with crisis pregnancy centers, anti-abortion fake clinics, whatever you call them, and who is and isn't beholden to even, upholding the standards of HIPAA gets a lot more complicated when abortion access comes into play. And the other point that you mentioned was just how we live our lives on and offline. I think there is a tendency when talking about the convergence of surveillance and the digital world to just push people to being Luddites, and I don't think that's the answer. So understanding that algorithmic surveillance can monitor all sorts of our activities and our associated identities, what issues along with abortion access are at risk of heightened monitoring, and what should abortion advocates be paying attention to, what's currently on the horizon, so that we can be best equipped with the information but still go on and live our lives and the multitudes within them.
Sure. Well, I appreciate this question because I always love the opportunity to think big picture about things, and especially to connect to the efforts in cross-movement organizing that I think it's paramount that we understand the connections between these various movements, especially for those advocating for bodily autonomy. We need to learn from each other how each one is being surveilled and criminalized and punished, because they're all going to have similarities, but they will also share similarities in seeking liberation and seeking safety. So a few to come to mind, I'm thinking of the rights for transgender people to have access to public space and healthcare. I think of the drug harm reduction movement, sex worker rights, disability justice, racial justice, and more. These all have various connections to each other, and obviously, many of us often live in more than one of these various marginalized positions. And the more that you occupy, the more likely you're to be at risk of being surveilled or affected by bad state decisions. When one piece of bad internet law targets one community, FOSTA SESTA comes to mind, we can measure the impacts of those harms falling on all these other communities beyond the initial target. So in the way that we can measure that sort of cross-movement impacts of harms, we can also collectively organize together and thwart these surveillance threats, and most of all, advocate for comprehensive federal data privacy legislation, because this is something that affects everyone, not just the targeted community du jour. And then we will be able to truly seek collective liberation. I think one last point that I want to get across is that as much as it can seem daunting and impossible to face these monumental threats of surveillance that are facing us online and off, there are so many people in these various movements I described and more that are advocating for better privacy and educating each other on how to keep private while also maintaining publicity for the messaging that we need to get across to destigmatize our movements. There's so much happening, and there is plenty of hope out there, and privacy is a possibility.
I love ending on an uplifting note. Thank you so much. Daily, and for viewers, if you have questions, please put them in the question box. But in the meantime, I'll turn the wheel over to Stephanie to speak with our next panelist.
Awesome. Thank you, Shireen, and thank you so much, Daly, for those points. I think we all really, really appreciate that expertise, and I also really appreciated how you kind of tied a lot of that information into some other movements that we know of. Because obviously digital privacy is a very intersectional issue. So thank you so much for your insight. And to contribute to some of that expertise, we are also joined today by Sarah Phillips, who we're very, very excited to have from Fight for the Future. So a little bit about Sarah before we start asking her some questions. Sarah is a community organizer, abolitionist, and creator from Houston, Texas. They were politicized around surveillance, online censorship, and digital privacy through years of youth organizing, abortion access, prison abolition, and South Asian diasporic racial justice movements. This led them to the digital rights organization Fight for the Future, where she focuses on LGBTQ youth, resistance to abortion surveillance, and free expression issues. In her spare time, she makes content about fandom, romance novels, and any passing media hyperfixation. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. So to kind of add on to some of Daly's expertise on the topic, the first question we have for you is kind of about what specific networks and platforms use algorithms that could potentially expose users' pregnancy-related information to anti-abortion interests.
Sure. First off, thanks y'all for having me. Reproaction has been wonderful in my own journey around resistance to abortion surveillance and teaching me so much about self-managed abortion and so many things as an organizer. So I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, as far as this question goes, I think y'all have set up this topic really well in terms of, laying out the context of why these algorithms exist, how they actually function. And the biggest thing, as has already been stated, is that they have to collect heaps and heaps of data on how you interact with the internet, what you search for, your location, etc., in order to run these algorithms that are, kind of keeping you on platforms, keeping you going to search engines, keeping you shopping, etc. And when we talk about specific networks and platforms, honestly, I kind of struggle with the question because it's more about like all of them are doing it, like which ones aren't doing it, right? Especially the ones that are attached to big tech companies, et cetera. I'm thinking of Google, Twitter, X, Meta. A lot of the big ones that a lot of folks are using are, you know, participating in this practice of collecting heaps and heaps of data in order to run these algorithms and opening people up to harms because that data gets given to data brokers and you know, law enforcement kind of, you know, are able to run around need for warrants, et cetera, by that information just kind of being out there. You know, we've already talked about how this is a threat to not just seekers, but also, you know, abortion workers, people who work at abortion funds, people who are healthcare workers, et cetera. I live in Texas, and I've had to go through and, you know, use delete me, think about where my address is, where my parents' addresses are, et cetera, because I'm vocal about abortion in a criminalized state. And this is an experience that loads and loads of folks in the abortion access movement are dealing with. And it's a really, really big problem, obviously. I've also heard from many, many people, you know, who engage in abortion storytelling and such, who have talked about how after accessing an abortion or after accessing information about Planned Parenthood or self-managed abortion through a search engine, they start getting ads about pregnancy. They start getting mailers about, you know, what hospital are you using, et cetera. They get ads related to maternal health care. They get ads about, you know, gifts for babies, et cetera. Like these kinds of things that are really invasive and also are just, you know, emotionally really hard for folks who are seeking abortion to start receiving. And, you know, I think that that's just something, you know, it's not directly tied to criminalization, but I do think it's something that we need to talk about, right? Like the idea that, you know, you could be tracking your cycle on a menstruation app that does not take data privacy and surveillance seriously. You could be tracking that and you then start getting ads about a pregnancy when you're not in a state to, you know, have a child, or you are seeking an abortion and having a lot of restrictions and difficulties to do that. I think that's an important part of the conversation. And also just that in terms of specifics, like in a landscape where right-wing actors and cops are looking from our service area to attack abortion seekers, the location tracking and messaging aspect, which we see on, again, we've already mentioned the Facebook incident where someone was criminalized because of evidence through Facebook messaging. You know, we think about location tracking messaging, you know, through Google, through Uber, through Lyft, through, you know, just a lot of folks are wearing watches that track where they are at any point in the day. We've seen from criminalized states that they are pursuing travel and location as a focus on abortion criminalization. And when you consider that these, you know, apps and mapping services are tracking where you are, where you parked, et cetera, that's not just subpoenable, like information that could be subpoenaed, et cetera. It could be brought up in trial, it could be given to law enforcement, but also we've also been very aware of the fact that a lot of the people in abortion seekers' lives who could put them in harm's way for accessing an abortion could be not even the government or not even, you know, right-wing actors that they don't know. It could be, you know, they are in an abusive relationship and that person wants to harm them. In Texas, what we saw is that there was a case where someone trying to access an abortion has now been brought to court by their ex-partner. And in Texas, how that functions is that, you know, the person who accessed the abortion is not the person who is brought to court. It is anyone who quote unquote aided and abetted the abortion. So the people actually brought to court were the person's friends. Like this person tried to seek an abortion, texted their friends, and those friends are the ones that are wrapped up in this lawsuit. So, you know, that just like, you know, and I I think that's a good case of like thinking about surveillance and algorithms and, you know, all this kind of stuff being wrapped up into many different forms of surveillance, and how just really emphasizing digital privacy and thinking through like, you know, every aspect of our lives we are using tech tools that could open abortion seekers up to harm. And, you know, we need to be really, really real about emphasizing digital privacy in our everyday lives while also not creating more obstacles for abortion seekers, which is a really, really hard line to walk.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I think that you did a really good job of kind of putting the extent of this issue kind of into perspective. And I liked how you put it of, you know, it's not really about what networks are doing it. It's more about which networks are not doing this, and trying to part which ones that are safe, rather than the plethora of networks that everyone is using, that are using this kinds of software. So thank you for that information. And kind of with all of that, and you really kind of talked about the extent of these issues, and also a good reminder that, you know, a lot of this doesn't just impact the ways that we're interacting with law enforcement, but it can also impact our relationships with partners, family members who might also disseminate our information. So given this extent of this issue, obviously a lot has kind of changed with digital privacy and abortion access within the past few years. So how do you think that the Dobbs decision impacted the landscape of digital privacy for abortion seekers? How has algorithmic surveillance really kind of developed in this new playing field post-Roe and really affected the extent of this issue?
Sure. So, you know, I always say, like, living in Texas, like, the Dobbs decision was not the beginning of abortion criminalization in this country. However, it did open up a whole new world of ways to criminalize abortion. And for states that already had extreme limits, you know, it has become just a minefield to actually access an abortion. And, you know, just specifically like where I live, you know, most folks are accessing abortion through travel or through self-managed abortion. At home or in a safe place with mifepristone and misoprostol. This has meant that there is, like, one, so many more barriers, and two, much more attack surface for right-wing actors in this area of digital surveillance. You know, one thing that I emphasize a lot to folks who don't really understand how people access abortion and how that intersects with tech tools is, like, you know, from the moment someone realizes that they could be pregnant, they have already probably used tech tools that have maybe identified them as possibly pregnant. And then from every step, therefore, like beyond that, there is a tech tool involved in how that person might access an abortion. So whether that's a search engine, a social media site, a text to a friend, finding an abortion fund, that abortion fund calling them to set up what they need to set up, using a map, using a ride share, booking a flight, booking a hotel, ordering pills online. You know, we talk a lot to abortion funds who are thinking a lot about financial surveillance right now, because a lot of them have to use like Venmo or PayPal, et cetera, like these financial transactions from abortion fund workers' personal devices to a seeker's personal device. Like there's a whole surface area just in that. And, you know, these are the kinds of things that we're having to think through really, really carefully post-Dobbs. And also just that, you know, right-wing actors have already named these things as things that they're thinking about when they think about travel and think about financial surveillance. Like they want nothing more than to look at an abortion fund and say, I've been able to censor them online. I've been able to stop them from giving money to people. I've been able to stop them from getting people access to abortion. And they are naming self-managed abortion, abortion pills, and abortion pills in the mail as, you know, a real target as well. So, you know, I think that there's, you know, we just need a better emphasis in general on, one, protecting yourself digitally, but two, just that, like, as has already been named, the reason that all of this is able to happen is because we have a real lack of privacy legislation in the United States that protects us from these things. And two, that so much of our landscape through tech monopolies is controlled by big tech companies that don't care about abortion seekers, that don't care if we live or die in red states. You know, they don't have a vested interest in people, and they've been able to kind of suck up this entire ecosystem and, you know, operate under this surveillance capitalism that means that they are extracting as much data from us as possible, and that's how they're running their companies. Like, there's so many different ways that we need to interrupt that. And, I think for me, one thing, I do want to offer hope is that, a lot of folks in repro have really been thinking about this and are really at the forefront of this. And like, as someone who works in tech policy, really seeing like, folks from red states who really get this going to lawmakers and being like, we need this for XYZ, and like seeing more movement on that. Like, it's not perfect. It's not all the way there yet, but I do want to say that like, there has been wider understanding of the need for that. Let's see. And I also just want to say that I always feel the need to point out the connection to other movements that are experiencing suppression. For example, when we think about financial surveillance, in Georgia, we're seeing the state cracking down on Stop Cop City organizers through means of financial suppression, folks who are organizing, against policing, against, their public dollars being put more and more into policing and not social services. And, they're being suppressed through this idea that, movement funds, mutual aid, et cetera, is something that can be criminalized, is illegal, et cetera. And, whenever I look at something like that, I have to imagine that that kind of attack will be copied over and over again. That's kind of how these right-wing folks operate. They introduce something in one state, they carry it over to another. Texas does something, therefore Alabama will do it, et cetera. So, just tracking how other movements are being criminalized and thinking about how that could be extended to abortion funds, how that could be extended to repro, and then also vice versa, right? We've in Texas seen that our attorney general is really, really ramped up and ready to go on trying to criminalize parents who are accessing gender affirming healthcare for their kids, and doing so through travel, right? Folks are traveling outside of the state for abortion access. They're traveling outside of the state to access gender affirming healthcare for their kids. And the attorney general wants to go after both of those things and is trying to use surveillance and lack of digital privacy, lack of privacy to do it. So those are all things that I'm thinking about and how things have changed. I really think that, like, again, to emphasize that Dobbs is not the beginning of abortion criminalization or digital surveillance of abortion seekers, but we really have to think about just the moment that we're in, and the fact that, like, folks who are involved in the abortion access space know that folks are running out of money to fund abortions, right? So what does that mean in terms of how people are traveling, how people are accessing pills, et cetera? Like, we need to really, really be thinking about digital privacy.
Yeah, and I really, really like that you kind of drew the role of activists and advocates into this, because I think you kind of mentioned something I really liked. You mentioned was that I think a lot of times with algorithms and online software is that it's developing faster than laws can really develop. And so there's really not ever a lot of oversight or legal oversight over these kinds of systems. So I like that you kind of mentioned that and really brought up the role that activists play in digital privacy. Which leads me really well into my last question for you, which I'm sure a lot of us at this point are kind of like, all right, this is sounding a little scary. This is obviously a really extensive issue. Sure. So what are some ways that internet users can protect their pregnancy information online? I know you kind of alluded to some, but what are some kind of key strategies that folks can use to protect their digital privacy?
Yeah, and the one thing that I want to say to open this up is that, when I talk to people who need or are needing to access abortions, when I'm talking to abortion funds, when I'm talking to people who are abortion doulas, et cetera, the thing that I say all the time is that, we don't want to give people one more obstacle, but we do want to make sure they're not criminalized for doing this, right? And so, the small ways that we can introduce digital privacy into our communities start honestly before someone needs an abortion, right? So I always say that taking care of each other is really important, and thinking about digital security as community care all the time, not just in a crisis moment when we don't want to add just another thing to the list of restrictions and the maze of obstacles that someone is facing when they realize that they need an abortion. So one thing that I talk about a lot with my friends and my communities, et cetera, is like, think about the day when you or your best friend or your mom or et cetera needs an abortion. What are the, maze of things? What are the things that you already want to have known when that day comes? And, you know, I think for a lot of people who are really tuned in, and I think if you're on this webinar, for example, you might be the person that people reach out to when they need an abortion, when they have a question about birth control, when they have a question about self-managed abortion or Plan B. I know I'm certainly that person. And so, you know, what are the things that we already need to have done? So you know, we talk about Signal all the time, but, you know, it's not just having Signal on your phone. It's not just like getting Signal in that moment. It's like, I use Signal for almost everything. You know, I talk about with my friends, like, you know, I've every trusted person that I know that I would need to reach out to if I needed an abortion, I already have on Signal. I know that they have Signal on their phones. All the people that I would need to message in a crisis use it, are ready to use it. And that's honestly, it's one of those things that can be kind of hard to get people to do, right? Like, just being honest, like, you know, I think that I'm never want to be the doomsday figure, but I am just like real about the, you know, the threats in our lives. And it can be really hard to establish those things, like I said, in a moment of crisis. So just practicing the things that will protect not just you, but the other people on the other end in our daily lives, I think is really important. And just like a harm reduction thing, you know, I think it's not just abortion. Like, so many people in the movement are involved around organizing around Palestine, organizing around the military, organizing around, you know, gender affirming healthcare, supporting trans people, you know, supporting the Repro movement, supporting abortion funds. Like, those are all things that, you know, we are seeing are being criminalized. Like, that's just to protect each other. You know, we've already talked about, I think we talked about Yuki, but just if you menstruate and are tracking your cycle or your health, or tracking someone else's cycle or health, or are tracking, if you're in any sort of situation where you're accessing healthcare that might be criminalized and you're tracking it on an app or your phone's calendar, I do recommend switching to something like Yuki, EUKI, which we work with them, I trust them, and they've built in like every possible privacy-minded protection that they could. Or just honestly going to analog, right? Like, you can use a physical calendar for these kinds of things. And sometimes analog is best, you know, like, we have all these tools that are at the ready, but they're not really safe tools. So, you know, sometimes analog is best. And then, yeah, turning off all the things that you can on location tracking and data collection on the apps on your phone. So like on Google, for example, I think most people now have the option to set it up so you can keep the data on your phone instead of stored within the Google Cloud. And then also going back and deleting data, you know, setting up your messages that they delete on Signal, like these kinds of things. I think, like, in terms of searching and what actually to do, there's a lot of guides out there, particularly the one that I'm thinking of is from Plan C Pills, they're pretty good about like featuring that on their site. But yeah, there's things that you can do, but just in terms of like the thing that I think you can do every day is kind of instituting these things before you need it, and thinking of digital security for your family and your friends as community care and things that we should do every day, and not just in the moment of emergency when we need it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And I really liked that you kind of talked about some preventative measures that we can sort of take for protecting our information and other people's as well. So I think, like Shireen said, I think that kind of left it on a somewhat hopeful note that there are some ways to really protect your privacy, given the extent of the surveillance that we're seeing now post-Dobbs. So I thank you so much for your expertise. Sarah and Daly, we're so happy that you guys were able to join us today and offer us some really amazing insight to this topic. We are done with kind of this Q&A portion of the webinar. I'm going to pass it over to Shireen now, who's going to take us into some next steps. I also just want to remind folks, if you have any questions for Daly or Sarah, you can put them in the questions part of the webinar or the chat function, and we will get into those questions for our Q&A portion later. So I will pass it over to Shireen.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm already seeing some really good questions. We'll get to those in a minute, but first some quick plugs. Now, Daly's with us from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which champions user privacy, free expression, and innovation through impact litigation, policy analysis, grassroots activism, and technology development, defending civil liberties in the digital world. And Sarah's joining us from Fight for the Future, a group of artists, engineers, activists, and technologists channeling internet outrage into political power, where technology is a force force for liberation, not oppression. As far as us, Reproaction, I already explained what we do and why we're here, but if you would like to learn more, here is where you can find it. We're at Reproaction pretty much everywhere that you can be added. So also, you can save the date for our next webinar in August. It is about Project 2025, which is a hot topic right now. What I'm particularly excited about for next month's webinar is we're not just going to say, here's what's happening and here's why it's bad, but also the particular dreaming for what a left progressive abortion forward project for the future could look like on our side of the aisle, as well as scenarios planning on how we can organize to fight back. So with that, I will pivot to some questions. We got one that I can just hit really quickly, just asking the name of the app that Stephanie mentioned. That's Euki, E-U-K-I, and that is a period tracking app that also provides a lot of really helpful sexual health information. We actually featured a representative from the Euki app on our August webinar last year on sex ed. So you can find that on our website if you're looking. Next, someone asked if there will be notes sent to participants after the call. There will not be notes, but there will be a recording sent out if you registered, regardless of if you attended or not. Also, our closed captioning isn't working today, but the recording will have the capability for closed captioning. Apologize for that. This was a buggy tech day. Go figure, we're talking about a techie topic. Okay, next question is really juicy, and I will open the floor for this one to Sarah and Daly both. So this is someone asking, we use targeted digital advertising to reach potential patients and connect patients in states with bans to our abortion clinic in a state where abortions are legal. How do we keep people seeing our ads safe? Is it problematic that we use this type of advertising? How do we connect people with our clinic to get the care they need without jeopardizing their safety? I think that's exactly the kind of question we wanted to be getting people thinking about. So I'd love to send the floor over to our speakers.
Shireen, could you repeat the question one more time? I apologize.
Not at all. I muted myself. I can distill it. It's someone who works for a clinic who uses targeted ads to reach people in banned states when they have a clinic in a safe state, what they can do to keep their patients safe and not jeopardize safety.
Sure, yeah. One thing I'll say is that that is something that we've run into a lot where, folks who are in kind of the tech space, are talking to funds. I think in particularly we've talked to folks in Texas who work around minors accessing abortion who need the targeted ads in order to get right in front of the people that they need to. I think kind of like I mentioned, one thing that I've appreciated about our work with Plan C Pills is that they really do kind of get the information about digital privacy methods in front of seekers as soon as they possibly can when they reach their site. It's kind of the first thing that you see. I've also talked to folks at clinics and funds who talk about kind of the first measure that they take when folks call. I don't know what your calling service looks like, is folks calling in and being told, don't tell us really personal information or identifiable information. We'll kind of take this information to a trusted messaging service when you call in. So I think there's kind of harm reduction methods that we can take in terms of making sure folks don't need to feel like they give us a lot of identifiable information in the actual interaction. And then also just that, there's kind of just things that because like I said, there's folks who just need to survive and get the information to people, and then there's also these big tech companies that are kind of operating in a certain way that make it really hard to do both protect people and to get the information in front of them. And so I think it's just weighing we need this information to get to people. And I think there's also something here also about the information that's extracted in order to get that targeted advertising, like that is on the fault of big tech companies who operate in that way, where that information can be, subpoenaed and or susceptible to surveillance or law enforcement, et cetera. So, I think that it's kind of like a, we do what we can, and also like these things are still happening and we need to be legislatively pushing back against it, making it really clear to the folks that they're putting these folks in danger, and while also surviving and getting people the care they need.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think something to consider, whether the tool is technology or something else, if we stop using that tool or tactic, the bad actors won't also stop. Something doesn't have to be used nefariously, even if it has the power to do so. And when there is something as vital as getting patients in banned states information they need to get the best care possible, it's all about, like what Sarah said, reducing harm and using tools with the council of experts with the right use cases in mind to make sure we're doing so ethically. But yeah, I really appreciate that question and response. I'll pause in case Daly wanted to add, otherwise I'd go to the next one. Cool. Next question, could you talk about specific provisions you would want to see in privacy legislation at the state level? Federal would be preferred, of course, but question mark.
Yeah, I can jump in here. One thing that we've really been talking about at Fight for the Future and pushing for, again, like this is again at the congressional level, but with the hope that like there are some of these protections put in certain states, is legislation against data brokers, really making it really impossible for data brokers to be able to extract people's email addresses, physical addresses, phone numbers, information, et cetera, and hosting them on those sites that kind of open people up to a lot of threat and harm. And then also just really kind of cutting big tech companies off at the knees in terms of how much data they can actually collect, how that data is used, how it's stored, et cetera. There's been some helpful things happening in states. And I will say that one kind of complicated thing in the tech policy world is that there's a lot of fights happening in terms of like if one state passes something and then there's a federal bill eventually, how those bills interact. So that's why we kind of have been focusing on the federal level in terms of like we want this protection for everybody across the country. But yeah, there's like, in California, there's been steps to protect people's digital privacy, and there have also been some in Europe, et cetera. But yeah, I think for us, it's data brokers, data collection, just really cutting that like font of information about people off, and that would really mitigate a lot of the ability for law enforcement and right-wing actors to actually access that information to criminalize people.
Yeah. I think we have Daly who wants to provide potentially context on this one and the previous question, so I'll go on mute for that.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry for the difficulty there of having some troubles unmuting. I guess to touch on the most recent question, so I'm not a lawyer, I'm a technologist, but so it's a little bit more difficult for me to understand the best kinds of provisions or bills or legislations that would have the best impact on things. However, one that has given me some hope lately is there is a California law that prohibits the sharing of out-of-state license plate reader data to law enforcement agencies. And this would be particularly impactful in states that have restrictions on abortion for people that are traveling across state lines to seek an abortion. So My colleagues have been doing some excellent work, some of my legislative activist colleagues and some of the lawyers that I work with, in suing police departments who are illegally sharing that automatic license plate reader data to other law enforcement agencies across state lines. And it's been pretty successful. Because that law already exists, I would love for it to serve as a blueprint for other states to enact similar legislations that create those sort of borders between states and prohibit that sharing of data. That's just one example. And then if I could, I'd like to touch back on the question about advertising a little bit. Just from an implementation angle, I think there are a few steps that you could ask yourself if you are implementing advertising mechanisms or tracking mechanisms in your website that could helpfully reduce the impact of harm that you might be causing inadvertently. A couple big questions or big picture questions I would ask is, what information is actually necessary for the advertising to actually work? Can you reduce it to the only essential bits? And can you compartmentalize that action away from every other place on the website? Because you don't have control over how the advertiser or the tracking mechanism that you're using uses that data elsewhere. And as we know, those companies are profit driven. So they're going to be on the more generous side of sharing. I would also ask, are you fingerprinting the users? Are you fingerprinting them based on their device, their browser type, the fonts they have installed, etc.? If you can't answer that question for yourself, can the tracker that you're using answer it for you? Can you pseudonymize that data that is being used to fingerprint users? These are all just some questions you can look for. However, I suspect you might be using Facebook Pixel because it's sort of like the most common mechanism for smaller organizations to use to track their users and deliver context-based advertisements. There are a few steps that you can take to minimize the harms being done by Facebook. First, you can only place the pixel on the necessary or relevant pages, especially those with ongoing advertising traffic. So you're creating like a wall, a compartmentalization between that place and the other places. You can also turn off what is called automatic configuration, which stops the button click and page metadata from being transmitted elsewhere. It's a specific feature in Facebook Pixel that you can do. And then you can turn off another feature called advanced matching. This is a feature that allows Pixel to look for the recognizable form fields and other places on your website that contain information, personally identifiable information like name and address and email, and share that elsewhere. So if you turn off those little bits on Facebook Pixel, you can still have it work while somewhat protecting the amount of data that is being shared elsewhere.
That is hugely valuable information. I really appreciate you sharing. And a reminder to folks that this recording will be sent out to all registrants and available on our YouTube. So if you were taking notes during, you can finish those notes or refill them with some of the nitty-gritty of that once we get the recording out, probably tomorrow. Okay, so we got a question that I personally don't even know how to translate, but this question is, do fusion centers complicate segmenting data like ALPRs to prohibit federal law enforcement and other state law enforcement from accessing that information? I don't have the technical knowledge. I hope either of you will.
I don't. Maybe Daly does. As the not technologist.
I saw an unmute. Again, sorry all for these tech issues.
Repeat the question for Dali.
Yes. Do fusion centers complicate segmenting data like ALPRs to prohibit federal law enforcement and other state law enforcement from accessing that information?
Oh, okay. I'm happy to touch on that.
Beautiful.
Can you hear me okay? Just checking again to see if I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. So once again, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is, for those who don't quite understand or are unfamiliar with the terminology, fusion centers are these like hubs where information about like threats or risks are shared between different agencies or private, like both like state funded agencies like law enforcement and maybe some federal ones, and also maybe some private security networks as well, homeland security, et cetera, et cetera. Do they complicate the landscape of sharing automatic license plate reader data? Yeah, for sure. I don't know at what point a identified elevated level of risk, such as if an organization or individuals affiliated with an organization are deemed a terrorist threat by the FBI, which is a common threat in the abortion access space. We have seen a tenfold increase in abortion access organizations being labeled as terrorist threats. So I'm not sure at what point that elevation of risk supersedes the state level laws saying that ALPR data cannot be shared across state lines. My understanding, though, is that these are constitutional rights to privacy that we still maintain, and they can still be contested in courts. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not speaking with confidence on that, just a bit of understanding about how the legal system kind of works. But as we know, a lot of us are running ragtag grassroots groups who might not have access to the resources one would need to challenge those claims in courts or to go after the law enforcement agencies that are sharing that data, regardless of the legality of it. Sorry, that's not a very helpful or optimistic answer, but hopefully it provides some insight into the question.
I mean, for me, that was super helpful, just understanding even the context of the question. So I super appreciate it. And yeah, ain't that the rub, being grassroots level groups and not quite having the firepower to follow up on suits. We have time for one more question. And so I'll go with, is there a consumer protection aspect of the push to stop the anti-abortion movement from weaponizing data and personal identifying information, PII?
Can you say it one more time, Shireen? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a consumer protection aspect of the push to stop the anti-abortion movement from weaponizing data and personal identifying information? I could see the case for it, but
yeah,
turn over to you.
I would say like there is a case for it, and I think that, again, I'm also not a lawyer, and a lot of this is wrapped up in kind of the agency aspect of the federal government. But that is something that I've kind of been thinking through in terms of, we're looking forward at an election. We're looking at like, what should we be asking administrations to do on the agency level? And that is certainly, kind of an aspect. And one thing I will say about that is that it is definitely a surface area for right-wing actors as well. Like, they are definitely kind of pursuing this argument on the flip side that is basically like an argument that, abortion funds or IUNA or Plan C, et cetera, are, hosting information about, pills that quote unquote is, their bullshit argument about it being unsafe that we all know is not true. So there's kind of, they're taking a consumer protection angle from the other aspect. And in terms of like privacy and digital privacy, in terms of federal legislation, that is definitely something that we talk about a lot in terms of like protecting users from, just leaks. Also, like, they're hosting this information, they're collecting heaps and heaps of data and holding it in data centers. We didn't really talk about AI, but that's kind of like part of, running these, huge algorithms and et cetera, and systems. They're hosting not taking care of our data. Like, we see a headline every single day about people's driver's licenses or information or whatever, just kind of being open to hacks, etc. So I do think it's a service area. I do think it's an argument. Whether or not we can kind of engage agencies in that manner is really dependent on administrations, really dependent on like who's in office, who's listening to us. But yeah, I think it's an aspect. It's just not really, in my opinion, being like well thought out right now. And it really is so dependent on like who's staffing these agencies, which I know it's a kind of a boring, but really a necessity in terms of like what we can get done in terms of consumer protection and protecting people.
If I may, there is one thing that both of us have touched on quite a bit throughout this discussion is data brokers. And that is a really specific threat to consumer privacy. I think a really kind of immediate and severe example of data broker abuse being used against the abortion access movement is this really pernicious case of this broker industry called Near Intelligence, which was gathering location data of people basically constructing geofences around healthcare clinics, reproductive healthcare clinics, and especially abortion clinics. And gathering the device IDs of people traveling in and out of those areas. As a unregulated data broker, they're able to do that, and then delivering selling that information to right-wing think tank and anti-group, who was then delivering anti-advertisements like pro-life, weird, like choose life, not abortion advertisements to those people's devices based on their traveling in and out of those geofences. And that's as much a privacy problem immediately facing the abortion access movement as it is a threat to consumer privacy. And it just goes to show how badly we need federal comprehensive data privacy legislation that impacts not just consumers, but because we are consumers, but every person who is at risk of these different weird criminalization measures, especially in the healthcare space.
Yeah. Retweet on all of that. And I do want to plug that the organizing that Fight for the Future is doing around data brokers and FTC, and the FTC is hosted on a campaign site, and it's called donotdox.com, and basically like trying to rally people around and against data brokers and that abuse that comes from an unregulated data broker industry, and also kind of laying the groundwork for exactly what Daly's talking about in terms of needing comprehensive privacy legislation in order to stop any of this. Like, we can talk about the companies, we can talk about the harms that they pose, we can talk about the surveillance, we can talk about data collection, but it really needs to be governments interceding and saying this is enough, like we're not doing this anymore. We cannot let them run amok and engage in these surveillance capitalist business models that just put people in danger. And they need to be able to prioritize that. And I think it's one of these things where it's hard for the average person who cares about abortion might not know what a data broker is, but we should be communicating in this kind of space where it's like, if you care about abortion, you should care about these things. You should care about digital privacy because they are a part of the same nexus. They're at the same intersection of surveillance. And so we need to think through like getting us to that place where we're talking about data brokers in the same sentence that we're talking about abortion access, or talking about data collection in the same sentence that we're talking about abortion access.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We're just a tad over time, but I'm really glad we tackled that last question. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Like I said, the recording should be available by tomorrow, and you can listen back and capture all that was said. So thanks again. Have a great rest of y'all's day. Bye now.
Thanks, y'all.